program today. Now, today's schedule is a little bit more tight than yesterday. Our sessions are not going to go for as long as they did yesterday, and so I want to teach you something very small. I come from a tribe called the Kikuyu, and usually at events like this, the master of ceremonies will encourage people to move things along very quickly, and he will say "karoheni," which means small lightning. And what you do as the audience is make a small lightning sound. Karoheni. Shall we try? Karoheni. Karoheni. Excellent. So when somebody comes and makes a presentation, that's what we're going to do. So let's kick off the program. Yeah, you like that? Yeah. Great. So we're going to kick off the program with what I think is a rather important conversation: how the West covers the global South. It's a conversation that I feel we so rarely have, which is why it's going to be interesting to see what the panel says today. And joining us digitally, we have Mr. David Beasley. I'm sure he's going to come. Yeah, please have a seat. David Beasley, who is the Executive Director at the UN World Food Programme. There he is. Karoheni for him. And finally, Alessandra Galloni, who is the Editor-in-Chief at Reuters. Welcome all.
But why do we fall south? Let's talk about it. Who cares about disasters abroad? A look at Western reporting on the global South. Shaping tomorrow, now.
So in preparing for this conversation, I remembered the words of the late Binyavanga Wainaina. He was a fiction writer in Kenya, and he said in his book, How to Write About Africa, this is an excerpt, broad brushstrokes throughout are good. Avoid having the African characters laugh or struggle to educate their kids or just make do in mundane circumstances. Have them illuminate something about Europe or America in Africa. African characters should be colorful, exotic, larger than life, but is the cause. And this is how I want to begin the conversation, Tomi. Why do you think it's so important that we should be talking about how Western outlets cover the global South?
Good question. I think because Western outlets are bigger, they have a bigger reach, and they affect the way the world sees. Sometimes when people want to confirm something, they Google, and the first thing that pops up is probably a New York Times or BBC or Guardian or whatever article. And sometimes people are not going to read 10 articles before they shape their view of a place. They will read the one or two, couple of headlines they see, and then they build from them. Or they turn on the TV and they look at these big cable channels, and then that's what they use to shape their ideas. And it's not just the global South, it's also how we see the rest of the world. We still turn to these big media. And if these big media outlets are not getting the story right, then we, the rest of the world, are getting a wrong view of these places that we're trying to live around.
You're still looking at our countries, at our people, at our multiple truths, through the singularity of a narrative that is almost what Edward Said once called Orientalism. It is a way of looking at us in which you think you're holding a mirror up to us, but when we look at that mirror, we don't see ourselves.
David Beasley, I'd like to come to you because the question of who cares about disasters in the global South directly affects to the work that you're doing. What do you think is one of the most probably undercovered or underreported issue that's currently ongoing?
Food security is probably your biggest issue the world is facing right now, and I think the West has really done a pretty lousy job in the last 5-6 years on that. You know, I was really hard on a lot of my friends in the media in the last 4 or 5 years. You turned on Western media in the last 4 or 5 years, it was 90% Trump, 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 or Brexit, 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 or COVID, 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 COVID. And regardless of your views on that portion of those issues, the coverage of the people that are struggling around the world and the amount of hunger that's rising around the world, we've seen, and I'm not talking about chronic 35 million to 276 million people, and now it's at 350 million people marching towards starvation in 40 in countries around the world, and within that you've got 50 million people knocking on famine door in 45 countries. Now, If I begin to explain that you've got every 4 seconds someone dying from hunger, why in the world will that not be front page news? Any and every newspaper and media outlet, radio and television and smartphones and social media in the world.
Let me ask.
I mean, it's preposterous.
David,
And if we don't get a handle on this, it's not just a nation with poverty and starvation is impacted. The entire world is impacted. And this is what I've really tried to do in the last 3 months with Ukraine. You cannot ignore the rest of the world while you focus on Ukraine.
Right. Before we get to
People are
Ukraine,
starving to death at
David,
night.
I need to ask Tomi a
In
question.
Somalia and Ethiopia and the Sahel, and I could go on and on. But anyway, the fact that the world is starting to cover global food crisis is great news. The bad news, it should have been done 10 years ago, because if you don't have...
Why are we so reliant on Western media to cover our issues?
We aren't. Sorry, that was for Tomi.
Yeah, but you can go ahead.
I'm so sorry. There's an assumption in this conversation that there's a we. There isn't a singular we. And that's the whole problem with this conversation. There is an assumption, because of the asymmetry of power, that every enlightened thought belongs to the West. That is then overseeing the rest of the world and telling us what is the problem with our human rights record, what is the problem with our foreign policy, what is the problem with our structural inequalities, what is the problem with the place of women in our societies, which is not to say that all of these things are not problems, and that it is not the job of us as journalists to ask all of these questions. But I think as an Indian, it really bothers me that what New York Times and Washington Post, where I have a column, say about my country's, let's say, record on the safety of women is going to be held up as the truth that the world is going to pay attention to. But what I have to say about the failure of, let's say, the Americans to mandate COVID vaccines, or to contain gun control, or to not give their women a right to reproductive autonomy, that's not going to be considered the narrative. So let's acknowledge that there isn't a we. This we is being foisted on us.
But yeah, Tomi, how did we get here?
100%. I think it's also this idea, this superiority complex, that if I see something, it happens, and if I don't see it, it doesn't happen. I mean, if there was a fight outside this room and a few of us went out and saw it, and I come back in and I tell you, oh, I'm the first Nigerian to witness that fight, you must think that's absurd. But that's how Western media go around talking about exclusive. We carry this exclusive tag as if it's some trophy, when actually it should be a shameful indictment of how poorly spread our coverage is.
Alessandra, I really want to clap for that point, because I think
is ensuring that local news organizations in any country are able to thrive. Because, of course, that's where you get the true deep global knowledge.
Right. So I was asking about the implication of poor coverage of the Global South. How does it affect the decisions that are made, for example, at the World Food Programme?
Big time, Edith. And it's absolutely critical that media get it right and they get the balanced coverage about what's really happening around the world, not just what's happening in Ukraine, not just what's happening in the United States, etc. And when we get the media coverage right, here's what happens. Political leaders respond. I can give you story after story. For example, 60 Minutes. We knew we had a high data port crisis when it was being blockaded by the coalition years ago. And we had 60 Minutes come in and do an absolutely devastating story on the impact. It entirely moved the American and European people, which in turn caused the political leaders in the West to respond immediately. The same thing occurred literally 6 weeks ago with the Odessa port. I couldn't get the media coverage to ramp up the reality that we were facing. Everybody was focused on just what was happening inside Ukraine, with a little bit of with the migration taking place in Europe. And we were trying to let the world know that you're going to have a global food crisis if you're not careful, if you don't open up that port. Well, 60 Minutes and many other major outlets began doing the proper coverage, which enlightened the political leaders around the world to respond, which is absolutely critical, because the media plays the most vital role of informing the public. And media is not informed adequately in a more balanced way, then we don't get reaction from political leaders that's necessary to bring the change that we all know needs to happen. So, and I could give you more stories, but Edith, you get the point right here.
Yes, I do. Thank you. So, Barkha, coming back to this question of journalists and how they're deployed in sort of local outfits, they are, rather, do you think that there's an element of them being used to tell a story and a narrative that has been formulated elsewhere?
I think I'm so glad that the point has been raised about what are called freelancers or stringers or fixers. There are different nomenclatures for them, and the language itself, I think, should cause all of us to pause and say, are we even using dignified sort of nomenclatures for basically a network of let's tell our own stories. Trust me, we're much more likely to be critical about what needs to be criticized than if we have the outsiders already wielding power, sometimes against our states, not governments, our countries. And then we're defensive and we feel like we've got to stand up as Indians against this hypocrisy, etc. So let's tell our own stories.
Isn't that a slippery slope? Because then that can create the notion that only Indians can cover stories from India, only Africans can cover stories from Africa, only Europeans can be based
No, I'm not saying can, but I'm saying that right now, traditionally, if you look at the two big, let's say, New York Times, Washington Post, if you look at The Economist, if you even look at, let's say, the BBC, Deutsche Welle, whatever, pick up any big global Reuters, right? I think Reuters does do a lot of local sort of hiring, at least in India. I have a number of colleagues who work with Reuters. But is it not true that it's essentially the gaze of another power structure, another culture, another socio-economic context, looking at my country, my people? I'm not saying that's not allowed.
Brutus was also told the same in Julius Caesar. So whose job is it to point out the bias?
That's a good question. I think now that we've got a world where people can respond, social media has given the audience a bigger platform. We hear a lot from them and they tell us what they want to hear. In fact, there used to be times when people would say in the newsroom that, oh, people don't care about this story, people don't care about that. But now we see hashtags uniting people from around the world and people forming communities virtually across the world. And that tells us that we as the news have been detached from what people actually want to hear. And we're talking about, for example, representation. Okay, we do have representation on the ground many times, but how much representation do we have in the newsroom? How many editors have come from these places, from these different countries around the world, and made it up into the newsroom to be able to make decisions about, for example, how a story is covered, what story makes the top, the headlines in the news bulletin, and who, for example, gets interviewed on a news topic. Many times when we're looking at different stories, I remember the malaria vaccine came up the other day and got approved, and all we heard was about the experts from different parts of the world. The Kenya Medical Research Institute was very heavily involved in that research. We didn't hear about them, we didn't see them being interviewed in the news. Where are they? They're erased. And so people from the global south end up being victims and villains, but never experts. And that is part of that framework where even if we're saying we want to have representation within the newsroom, I think that spills over to even the kinds of output, the kinds of people we interview. Just one more thing. I remember when George Floyd, the killing happened the other day, suddenly all these black people on TV, and I'm like, where have these people been? And then now that George Floyd's story is vanished, all the black people are gone. So what's going on? And that really needs us to sit and think about what it is we're trying to do, what it is we're trying to tell the world.
By the way, I just want to...
You jump on a plane, you fly there, then you jump up and down and say, we got a crisis here, folks. I know what's going on in Ethiopia is getting all the coverage, but don't forget about climate impact on the poorest of the poor, because the rest of the leaders were talking about climate mitigation. And I'm like, look, while you're working on climate mitigation caused by a developed nation, what are you doing about climate adaptation so people can survive? And one story won't cut it. It takes multiple stories to sensitize a population to respond. And that's what happened. there. The same thing in the Sahel. I went to the Sahel many times, including Sudan, and talking about the impact of ISIS, Al Qaeda, Boko Haram. If we don't get ahead of this, it will absolutely destroy the population. And then you give anecdotal stories back to back over. I did this over 2 to 3 years, and it took several years before I got the attention of global, particularly Western leaders, to realize that we've got solutions, but you're not providing them. If you don't act, you're going to pay them 1,000 times more than if you did nothing, so to speak. And so, anyway, I love this issue right here because this is where the coverage has got to be sustained coverage on issues that truly impact the world. And this is what was happening when COVID hit the scene and the world leaders were making decisions about COVID in a vacuum. And I went to the United Nations Security Council. Tony Blair called me and says, "What are you seeing out there?" This was really in the first couple of months. And I said, "Tony," I said, "everybody's making decisions about COVID in a vacuum, and we are going to have a cure. This could be worse than the disease. So we've got to handle a hunger pandemic with the COVID pandemic, making strategic, balanced decisions so that we can move forward." And so when I went to the Security Council and we hammered the issue, how to balance these two issues together, and media coverage was really quite remarkable for about a couple of months there that allowed leaders to begin making more sustained, proper decisions. It wouldn't shut down economies, wouldn't shut down supply chains and things like that.
Okay. We've only got...
Normally post foreign correspondents in to come and report and comment on your countries. Do that. It'll immediately take away the sense of asymmetry and defensiveness that we feel. Call me in to do a piece on what's happening with abortion and women in the United States of America. Call me in to comment on why the US can't have a female president. And then I'll be much more receptive to your talking to me about the place of women in my country. And third, diversity, diversity, diversity. Not just at layer 1, but where the power is wielded. We need more of us where the power is wielded.